You were a Remainer in the days and weeks before the Brexit referendum, but that you also predicted that we would leave the European Union. And I think you would then therefore say that your reasons for wishing to remain are now playing out. Would that be correct?
Well, at the same time that I predicted that Leave would win based on my research, which was based largely around the North and the Midlands, but I also predicted that regrexit would set in eventually, and that we would come to regret Brexit. And I think that's slowly happening. I think the less zealous Leavers are starting to feel that perhaps they were missold the Brexit fantasy rather than the Brexit reality. We're now starting to see. I mean, Brexit alone isn't the cause of our current collection of woes, but it's certainly a significant factor in that.
It's plain to see, though, that there are similar problems being faced by other countries across the world, and they're not in the aftermath of Brexit or anything like it. So, is that a univariant explanation for a multivariant problem?
Yes, you're right, Neil. In fact, it is a problem elsewhere, but it seems to be particularly a problem here, a collection of problems. And what's worrying is that we have Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, a man I've never thought fit to be Prime Minister, who doesn't seem to have a plan. He's a man of slogans, but when turning slogans into strategy, is a very different story. It was fascinating and alarming that while we had Kwasi Kwarteng, the business minister, in fact talking about how serious the situation was, we had Boris Johnson in New York, away from his United Nations, and Kermit the Frog episode, in fact, almost laughing off the problems back home, which either showed that either he was being completely flippant or he was out of touch. But he seems to often be out of touch. The man whose reputation was based on being able to connect with the people. I think that image is starting to actually become tarnished. The Teflon coating is starting to come off. And I think we're currently in an autumn of austerity, and I think there's a very real chance, as the Labour MP David Lammy predicted, that we'll be back to a winter of discontent.
Stay with me, Paul, while I bring in the panel to this to some of this conversation. Tom, to what extent would you place the blame on the pandemic, which after all has been a global phenomenon, in contrast to Brexit, which has been a British and or European problem? Do you think we're in this situation with ruptured supply chains and all the rest of it for much bigger reasons than Brexit?
Absolutely. The global community's lived through something that hasn't happened really before. I mean, obviously Spanish flu, 100 years ago there were lockdowns, but you made the point about there being nearly 8 billion people on this planet, and the dependency now we have on the likes of China for our supply chains and the just-in-time supply chains of our supermarkets, all that have all come about in the last 20 or 30 years as big businesses look to obviously make bigger margins and to profiteer off the back of that, including, by the way, unfettered cheap labour from the European Union. But I think to blame Brexit, when technically this country actually has only really been out of the European Union. I know we had the referendum back in 2016, but we've still actually been truly only out of the European Union for less than a year. So to somehow come up with all these conjectures about where our economy and society are now, and that is the fault of being outside of a supranational trading bloc, frankly, I find that incredulous and nonsense.
Emma, it seems to me that it's indicative of the way in which we've focused, or our authorities have focused so rigidly on the pandemic and the virus, and that it's almost unavoidable that everything else would have fallen down cracks in the floorboards. I mean, are we not just seeing the consequences of only being preoccupied with one thing and one thing only, being the virus.
I think that is exactly what's happened. The fact that, obviously, one of the reasons for this fuel shortage, it isn't actually a fuel shortage, it's a shortage of HGV drivers. And one of the primary reasons for that shortage of HGV drivers is the fact that the DVLA had to close down their testing centres, and so no new drivers could come in whilst lots of drivers were also retiring. And there have been people who've been warning about this for years and years and years, long before Brexit, that we had a crisis within the haulage industry, within logistics, that this was something that was going to come down the road anyway. And so to say that this is actually to do with Brexit seems absurd, because one of the reasons actually why haulage suffers and in trying to attract people into the industry is because the wages are so low. And one of the reasons why the wages are so low is because the wages were suppressed because of the European Union. And this is something that one MP has made a point about. So it's not a kind of pie in the sky suggestion to say that actually, yes, maybe we need to bring in some HGV drivers as an emergency, sort of for the emergency situation that we're now in. But long term, actually, we need to drive wages up in order to attract people in the first place. So I think that when we're talking about the winter of discontent, firstly, we shouldn't be panicking because that leads to the scenes that we've seen where everyone's trying to. I saw a video of a woman trying to fill a plastic bag full of petrol because that just aggravates the situation and makes things worse. But also we need to be talking in realistic terms rather than just sort of trying to pin it on whatever political fad we have at the moment, Brexit or COVID or whatever.
Paul, to come back to you, do you think we're paying the price, or do you think the government is paying the price for having infantilised the population, panicked the population to a standstill? Is it any wonder that, given even the suggestion of a shortage of whatever, anything, fuel, that people would panic in this way? Are we not just reaping some of the whirlwind of all the panic that has been around us for the last couple of years?
Well, we have a fuel pump crisis, not because we're short of fuel, but because we're short of drivers. About 100,000, according to the Road Haulage Association, who, as your fellow guest said, have been warning about this problem for about 4 or 5 years. The shortage of drivers, and because it's becoming a bigger problem, the more and more we do online shopping, which of course increases the need for HGV drivers to deliver, not just the supermarket, etc. But I'm also, although the pandemic is a factor in all of this, clearly a factor, I think people are getting wise to the fact that government are trying to use the pandemic as a sort of catch-all flak jacket for every problem, every bad decision, some Brexit linked, some others. But everything, it's down to the pandemic. It's become, if you like, the go-to excuse. And a lot of the problems are not directly caused by the pandemic. They're caused by other factors, Brexit, by some bad decisions in, for example, in reducing radically our gas storage capacity. But I think we are heading for a winter of discontent. The combination, of cuts of government policies are going to actually have a negative effect. And I think there's a background of panic, within the Tory party about this. I mean, yesterday, apparently, there was quite a furious row in the cabinet about whether to actually do this Brexit pride-swallowing U-turn with the temporary or 6-month visas, for foreign drivers, and that eventually it was Boris Johnson who insisted to go down this road because I think he could see the backlash. But other, if you like, more ardent Brexiteers, because Boris Johnson, if you talk to members of Boris's family privately, Boris was never a die-hard Brexiteer at all. But he knew that the Tory party would want to be led, even whichever way the referendum had gone, would want to be led by a leaver. And so Boris, ever the opportunist with his great ambitions, decided that the best way to become Tory leader and prime minister was to become a Brexiteer. But he was never a wholehearted Brexiteer when you talk to people close to him. Boris is a master opportunist.
Do you think this?
Opportunism sometimes only lasts for a certain period of time.
Do you think this exposes the notion of the new normal as somehow hollow? Just a statement with nothing much behind it to hold it up.
I think that's absolutely right, and levelling up even more so. I mean, levelling up is a slogan without a policy, and that is the big danger for this government, is that levelling up doesn't materialise at the sort of pace that the government have promised. Now, with a majority of 80 seats, normally you could guarantee that the Tory party would win the next general election. But it's so volatile. I'm not predicting they're going to lose it. I think it's too early. But we're in such a volatile period politically and socio-economically that I think that you can't rule anything out. An 80-seat majority is no longer guaranteed. I wouldn't bet against the Tories retaining it, but I think anything could happen almost.
Emma, don't you? I don't know. Do you agree with me that the problem they're facing is that they allowed us to fantasise about this notion of working from home, getting everything delivered, a new normal, and the infrastructure simply wasn't there, and that the wheels are beginning to fall off of the wagon at the first challenge.
Completely. You can't run a country like that. You can't have a society that lives in that way. We always knew that further down the line we were going to have to pay a serious cost for this decision to focus the governance, every aspect of governance of our society on one issue, on one virus, that there were going to be consequences for that. So the HGV issue, I think, has just been aggravated by the pandemic. It's been aggravated by a number of things. It's just another example of what happens when, everything closes down and therefore HGV drivers can't get their licences, and so you end up with a shortage of HGV drivers. Of course you do. But I think, going back to what you said earlier, that this is the result of that monomaniacal focus on just one issue. This new normal is not possible. Human beings cannot live that way. And the only way that human beings could potentially live that way is, as you were saying earlier, if you keep them sort of gripped with fear, and if you totally reorient the relationship between the individual and the state, which people will not be content with. So in that sense, I think if we're going to have a winter of discontent, it's going to be in the more sort of social sense, rather than as a result of all of these total failures.
Can I just challenge this notion, though, Neil, that somehow if you're a Brexiteer, you're anti-immigrant? Because, obviously he points to Boris Johnson and he's got on the record quite a liberal view of immigration. Actually, so have I. I didn't fight in the Brexit referendum to pull up the drawbridge of Great Britain and sort of sail off into the middle of the Atlantic like some Remainers try and, in a sense, smear 17 million people who voted in that referendum. The issue here is that for 3 decades now, in this country, we have got far too used, there's employers, in particular big business, have got far too used on the sort of methadone of cheap labour that's been coming from the European continent. In turn, what that has done is not only suppressed wages, but it's added to the costs and the challenges around our infrastructure, getting a primary school place, getting a National Health Service appointment. And back to your point about the failure of our technocratic leaders, instead of taking us as a country on that journey of adding, in effect, a population the size of Scotland in the space of, 15 years to this country, taking us on that journey, ensuring that we're not just investing in our infrastructure and in our public services, that we're also investing in training and workforce development. And guess what? The Labour Force survey will tell you that employers over the last decade have cut their investment in training by half. Apprenticeship numbers at the moment, until actually quite recently, were going up and now are going down again. So I think the solution here with the HGV lorry drivers, actually I support them being put on the occupational shortage list. After all, that's what it's there for. We do have a shortage. But I think we should be doing what they do in the United States with the HB2 visa, which is a similar skilled visa entry route. The employer has to pay a charge for bringing in the foreign worker And that money is ring-fenced then to spend on apprenticeships and training. So if we charge just £2,000 for one of these foreign worker HGV temporary visas, that would create a fund of £200 million that could be used to then invest in the HGV lorry drivers, in the domestic workforce, to get to a point where we haven't got this critical shortage.
Paul, a last question to you. You mentioned the just-in-time delivery systems that we've come to depend upon. It seems to me that we're also dealing with just-in-time politics, that rather than having any kind of strategy, any kind of long-term vision regarding infrastructure or anything else, our leaders are just dealing with problems on a day-by-day basis, and that challenges like this expose that for the hopeless solution that it surely is.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think we have a cabinet, with some exceptions, which is a very weak cabinet, because it's a cabinet chosen either because of its almost blind loyalty to Boris Johnson personally, or because they are Brexiteers. There are very few Remainers in ministerial posts. There are some very able Tories on the back bench, but who, because they were Remainers, are not in government. And I think that is another downside of Brexit, is that almost if you're not a Brexiteer, with the odd exception, you don't get a place at the top tables of government. But I think, let's wait and see. But I don't want Brexit to fail, even though I'm a Remainer. But I think it is failing, and I think that the public mood will change. I mean, Brexit was also voted in by a minority of the British public, really. And of course, the generational change is going to be—it's a minority in the sense of the turnout factor. But all the polls now show.
But that's just statistics. It was the vote for Brexit was the largest democratic movement in British electoral history.
Yes, it was. But if you look at the age demographics, so many young people who, by and large, are anti-Brexit didn't vote. The lowest percentage turnout of that referendum vote was among the young, which I think is quite
any
interesting.
election, any referendum has to be a snapshot of any given moment. The demographic of the population is what it is at that moment.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.